Hi, everybody, and welcome. Thank y'all so much for attending our inaugural Election Protection CLE in our little CLE series we're doing this summer. We've got a lot to cover, and I'm not going to give you your CLE number till the end, unfortunately. So let's get started to make sure that you guys can get that and get on with your lovely, if not somewhat toasty evening, assuming that we're all in Texas. Just one moment. Just going to go back and forth between these two slides. Make sure everybody's seen it. Okay, great. All right. Welcome to our CLE. I want to start by introducing myself and the organization I work for. My name's Emily Eby. I have been at TCRP since 2018. This is my third election cycle, which I've learned is enough to make one quite grizzled, at least on the inside. And I've been working on election protection the whole time. And am very happy to, have some semblance of knowing what I'm doing this time around. Texas Civil Rights Project, many of you may be familiar with. We are Texas Lawyers for Texas Communities. One of my favorite things ahead of another organization once said was that TCRP is the lawyers for the movement, which almost makes lawyers sound cool. I guess we're on a CLE, so I should be kind about lawyers, but this is a space that is safe for lawyers and non-lawyers alike. TCRP was founded in 1990, 1 year older than I am. We are nonpartisan. I'll talk about some of the things that political parties have done in Texas in the past. But TCRP, we're 501c3, we are nonpartisan. I will help anybody vote regardless of who they're voting for. We have 3 programs: Beyond Borders, Criminal Injustice, and Voting Rights. If y'all are interested in some of those other programs, please check out our website, txcivilrights.org. And our other programs are amazing. TCRP has done some form of election protection since 2016, and that's what we'll be talking about tonight. Voting in Texas. So as I'm hoping most of you have voted in Texas before. I'm hoping none of you have had any issues voting in Texas before. But the history of voting rights in Texas is fraught, to say the least. This is going to be a 30,000-foot view. It is voting, 300 years of voting, 200 years of voting. It's a lot to cover, but we will do our best. And if you have any questions, feel free. I believe you can drop them in the I believe you can send them to me, actually, directly, and I will answer them as best I can at the end. So feel free to drop any questions you have to me in the chat there. But we'll start by talking about voting in the United States. Now, most of us have probably taken constitutional law, so a lot of this may be familiar to you, but I've got some pretty graphics, so at least that'll be new. Who gets to vote? I want to start by talking about this in a way that I've learned is more helpful for me over the past couple of years in my work at TCRP. We tend to think of voting as like a straight line of progress, but I like to see it as is expanding and contracting circles, and whoever gets to vote is in those circles. America starts, as we all know, by extending the right to vote only to white men who own land. And I also want to note, I think we talk a lot about, white landowning men were the first to get the right to vote, but we don't talk a lot about when the landowning requirement dropped out. And 1828 was the first presidential election where white men did not have to own land to vote. And it persisted in some form until 1856. That at various state levels that you had to own land to vote. But after 1856, it was all about other forms of voter suppression. And then in 1870, the circle extended to Black men with the 15th Amendment. Still, women could not vote, so Black women could not vote. But then, of course, the end of Reconstruction. I know that it is very wonky and history-y to talk about Reconstruction as part of the history of voting rights in Texas, but it was really huge. And you know, not to sound like a history teacher, but Rutherford B. Hayes won the presidency by promising to end Reconstruction and pull all of the Union troops out of the South, where they had been meaningfully protecting the right to vote for Black men in the South. And Rutherford B. Hayes was like, if you give me political power, I will take away the protections for those people and you can suppress your hearts out. And I, you know, very wonky, but it's just one of those things that makes me feel more than anything like some things never change. Political power will always, voter suppression will always follow political power. And it's really frustrating, and I think we can do better. And then in 1920, white women won the right to vote. But Indigenous people were not given the right to vote in federal elections until 1924, and it took until 1962 for all of the states to adopt the right to vote for Indigenous people. In 1943, Chinese American immigrants were allowed to vote when Congress repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act. Black people were not meaningfully protected in the vote until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We'll talk a lot about the Voting Rights Act tonight, if you can believe it. But all American voters were protected by the VRA, but people of color were especially guarded, not just Black people, all people of color, as the VRA banned any racial discrimination in voting, and it banned discrimination based on being a member of a language minority group, which often overlaps with being a person of color in America. In 1971, 18 to 21-year-olds got the right to vote. I like finding the relevant, cool graphics for the 18 to 21-year-olds. You could tell that these two clip arts definitely have a TikTok. Other good things that happened in, you know, the history of voting in America, as these circles are expanding, what could go wrong? Everything's so great. 1913, it was we won the right to directly elect U.S. senators. State legislators used to elect U.S. senators, and you know, that might actually have turned out the same in Texas right now, but I still would not be wild about this particular legislature electing our senators. In 1994, Supreme Court outlawed white primaries, or ruled them unconstitutional, to more correctly say it. We'll talk a lot about white primaries either, because that is a Texas racism innovation. DC residents won the right to vote for president in 1961. In 1962 to 64, the Supreme Court established one person, one vote, which, you know, still exists with varying levels of success and oversight. But the one person, one vote standard meant that the weight and worth of citizens' votes must be nearly the same as much as is practicable in drawing districts and things like that. In 1964, they finally abolished poll taxes. That feels very late. And then in 1993, the NVRA passed federally. And the NVRA set minimum national standards for access to voter registration. You could not have a voter registration date that was more than 30 days out from the election date after the NVRA, and created the Motor Voter Program, which required that if you do a transaction for your driver's license in any way, you're required to be offered the opportunity to register to vote at that exact same time. Everything's great. Look at all these voting rights we've won. What could go wrong? 2013 was, of course, the Shelby County decision. I get what I believe these 18 to 24 or 18 to 21-year-olds in this outer circle would call crispy about Shelby County. I will try to maintain an air of professionalism as I talk about the decision that fuels my rage day after day. But in 2013, the Supreme Court destroyed the Voting Rights Act because Chief Justice John Roberts said that voter suppression and racism were over. that's, technically not the words of the decision, but that's how I feel about them. So what was Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act before Shelby County got to it? I like to think of the Voting Rights Act, especially Section 5 and 4B, as a voter suppression seatbelt. And so forgive me for those of y'all who've taken law school classes since Shelby County came out. I'm sure you heard a much better explanation than what I'm about to give. But Shelby County overruled Section 4B, which held the formula for who was covered by Section 5. All the wonkiness to say, if states had a history of racism in voting, the Voting Rights Act put them under a pre-clearance requirement. That simply means that anytime any of those states or individual counties within states had a history of racial discrimination in voting, anytime they wanted to make a change to anything regarding voting, they had to get it pre-cleared by either a DC court, which I believe handled like 1% of pre-clearances, or the Department of Justice, which handled the other 99%. It was administrative pre-clearance. It was very, very lenient. We're going to talk about some stuff later on that I'm like, why would that have passed pre-clearance? But pre-clearance voting changes that these states would ask for were seldom rejected. This makes a lot of sense because if you have to submit it to the DOJ, you're probably not going to try to outright suppress votes. There are, of course, people who rose above having to tell the DOJ they wanted to do voter suppression, and we'll talk about them, unfortunately. But proposed changes were seldom rejected. The VRA acted essentially just as a seatbelt against egregious voter suppression. And then Shelby County v. Holder. I could talk about the facts of the case. Essentially, the Supreme Court had said, signaled that they did not think that the formula for who was covered by this law was up to date. They thought that it should be reevaluated, reassessed. Congress had the opportunity to reevaluate and reassess through legislation, and they did not do it. And the Supreme Court, just like they signaled, overturned Shelby County, leaving all of these states free to pass whatever voting rights laws they wanted without any oversight whatsoever, despite them clearly not having proven themselves to be worthy of that trust. And, true to form, after Shelby County, states removed or restricted all kinds of voting rights. I'm going to read from a Brennan Center report. Between 2011 and 2014, 13 states passed more restrictive voting laws, between 2011 and 2014, the bulk of this being after 2013. 13 states passed more restrictive voter ID laws. 4 states passed new restrictions on voter registration drives, which Black and Latinx voters utilize voter registration drives at twice the rate that white voters do. 3 states passed laws requiring registrants to provide proof of citizenship. As many as up to 7% of Americans do not have proof of citizenship readily available to them, including me, as I have a very expired passport. North Carolina eliminated same-day voter registration. Wisconsin made it harder for people who moved to stay on the rolls. 8 states passed laws cutting back on early voting days and hours, and 3 states made it harder to restore voting rights for people with past criminal convictions. And if you're more interested in voting while incarcerated or after incarceration, my colleague Carl Blair, who's on this call, is going to be doing a presentation on that next week that I'm very excited for. The states implemented all these laws, removed voters from registration rolls at aggressive rates. The day after Shelby County, Texas implemented a voter ID law that had been previously rejected. It had been illegal the day before, and then suddenly it was in play. 5 years after the ruling, over 1,000 polling places had been closed nationwide, and the areas that enacted the most new anti-voter laws were the areas with the highest Black turnout in 2008. It's, correlation, causation seems pretty strong. Justice Ginsburg's quote, I love this, it's such a good image. In her dissent to Shelby County, she said, throwing out the protection of the Voting Rights Act when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet. It is very prescient, and I believe that the rainstorm was actually a hurricane, and I wish we had even an umbrella to protect us. After Shelby in Texas, voter ID law implemented the next day. It's been much litigated, and it's different than it used to be, than it was, 2013. 750 polling places were closed in Texas alone, mostly in Black and Latinx neighborhoods, if you can believe it. Discriminatory redistricting maps were drawn. They eliminated straight ticket voting, which just happened within the last couple of years. And I know that there are good arguments for eliminating straight ticket voting, but in Texas, what I have seen in practice is that if you eliminate straight ticket voting, especially in places like Harris County, where there are 90 races on the ballot, what it does is create really, really long lines, which drive people away from the polls, and so much more. There are still groups of people who have never won the right to vote in the first place. Incarcerated people can't vote in 48 states. People with felony convictions can't vote for some amount of time after release in 32 states. People under guardianship because of a disability often lose the right to vote, and legal permanent residents cannot vote. This is where I jump in and say that people under guardianship for a disability and legal permanent residents not being able to vote, I think is terrible. It is not the official position of TCRP, but just to point out that there are still groups to whom the franchise has never been extended. After Shelby County, voting rights became less about expanding these circles, though. We have been since 2013 scrambling to protect the rights of those who are already in the circles, other than our friend the white man down there in the corner, who is still by and large completely unaffected by most of these voter suppression laws. Voting in Texas before the VRA. I learned a lot making the Texas section specifically, and I'm very excited to talk to y'all about it. History of suppression. The end of Reconstruction and the start of Jim Crow rolled voting rights way, way back. As I said earlier, for a long time, Texas was essentially a one-party state, and that party was Democrats. And in the era after Reconstruction, Democratic white primaries excluded Black voters, and in the Rio Grande Valley, they excluded Mexican American voters. And Texas was, at the time, a de facto one-party state. So if you couldn't vote in the primaries, then you couldn't vote at all. You could go in the general, but the decision had already essentially been made in the primary, and you weren't allowed to be a part of it. So when this went to the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court upheld it at first in 1935. They said that because the Democratic Party was its own organization, they could choose to discriminate against Black voters and Mexican American voters, and keep them from ever voting in their primaries. Then the composition of the court changed dramatically, not something we've ever seen, but the composition of the court changed dramatically. And in 1944, the Supreme Court, I wrote unupheld because I firmly believe that it was just a flip back. But they overturned the decision upholding white primaries in 1944. Texas also had a poll tax that was $1.50, which is $19, nearly $19 in 2022. I know that doesn't sound like a lot to some of us, but that is still at the federal minimum wage with taxes, a little less than 3 hours work. So if you have an 8-hour shift, that's, you're spending 3 of those hours to pay to be able to vote. Operation Eagle Eye. So the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. In 1964, Operation Eagle Eye went down, and I have a section later on voting rights Texas future. I think that a lot of what I'm going to talk about right now could be something we're going to see in the fall. Knock on wood, but In 1964, during the presidential election, the Republican National Committee went on a project to deploy 100,000 poll watchers to intimidate Black, Indigenous, and people of color who were voting. 10,000 of those were in Texas. A full tenth of these poll watchers were deployed to our state alone. The director of Operation Eagle Eye, Charles Barr, said that he expected to, quote, successfully challenge or discourage from voting 1,250,000 persons. He specifically he said he wanted to challenge or discourage from voting 1.25 million people. And then in the same article, this one here on the slide, he said there was nothing, quote, discriminatory in Eagle Eye against any race, creed, or economic status. That was not how it worked out in person, if you can believe it. In Arizona's Maricopa County, there was a poll watcher who was accused, credibly, of intimidating voters outside a polling place. A federal judge wrote that every Black or Mexican person was challenged to read the Constitution in English and then interpret it before they could go into the polling place. And the poll watcher who was doing that was allegedly future Chief Justice William Rehnquist of the United States Supreme Court. There were obviously, tactics like that all over. But I just think it's so fun that Rehnquist was personally out there intimidating voters in Arizona, and while 10,000 of his buddies were here. There were scare tactics outside of just the voting process too. I've got this flyer here to the right. This was from the this organization does not exist. I can't emphasize that enough. Harris County Negro Protective Association. This flyer was meant to intimidate Black voters with complete untruths, trying to scare them out of voting by saying that you could get arrested if you even try to go to the polls. If you've done any of these, if you've had any of these common things like traffic tickets or speeding, or if you've been questioned by the police, you shouldn't go to vote. This was a complete lie, and they distributed these flyers in Harris County to try to scare Black voters. In Harris County and Travis County, the GOP of the county organization claimed that fictitious voter registrations and phantom voters were appearing on the rolls. This claim was disproven by the Austin American. When they went to investigate, they found that the GOP had altered the addresses that they were saying were phantom voters. One they altered to a graveyard, so at least they were on theme. But things like this to try to scare people out of even going to the polls. And then, of course, if people do brave all these scare tactics and show up to exercise their very common right to vote, then they're greeted by somebody standing outside the polling place or inside the polling place, there to challenge them, there to make sure that they don't cast their vote because of their race. Voting in Texas under the VRA. Now I will say things got better. The Voting Rights Act was very, very helpful. I'm not denying that. However, it is Texas. There will always be voter suppression shenanigans. This we can count on. Prairie View A&M. Prairie View A&M is just about an hour, a little over an hour, hour and a half outside of Houston. It is a college that was founded in 1876. It was not in the A&M system at the time because the A&M system did not yet exist, but it was founded in 1876 to help freed slaves enter the workforce. It is the largest historically Black college or university in Texas. And so, of course, people are trying to suppress the vote there. In the mid-1970s, the Waller County Elections Administrator forbade Prairie View A&M students from voting unless they or their families own property in the county. And they distributed all these questionnaires. The students were, freaked out that they had done something wrong. They were like, here, fill this out. Tell us if you own property or not, and then we'll say if you're allowed to vote here. In Texas, the law for college students is that they vote where they consider their primary place of residence. So there are college students who, they live in Austin, they want to vote in Austin, they go to UT, they like going to UT, and they don't know where they're going to end up after college. They can vote in Austin. But if the same student, I am from Wichita Falls, Texas, if I went to UT and I knew that I was going to move back to Wichita Falls, I considered it my home, I'm there every, Christmas and Thanksgiving, it would also be acceptable for me as a college student to vote in Wichita Falls. Of course, you have to choose which one of the two, but you get a choice between your home county of residence, if it's in Texas, or the county your college is in. You do not have to own land or property in your college town to vote there. In 1979, the Supreme Court upheld Prairie View A&M students' right to vote in Waller County. And then in 1992, 19 Prairie View A&M students were charged with improper voting. This was a scandal. It was a scam. I mean, this was a racket. There was one student who was charged with voting twice when it was his father's vote that they counted as the second one because his father had the same name as him, which is not unprecedented in the history of America, right? We all know that fathers have the same names as sons, and I assure you our voting system can handle it. The cases were dismissed for lack of evidence. They were completely bogus, but Prairie View A&M students had to rally. I love this photo of them protesting the Prairie View 19 voting students who were attempted to be suppressed with bogus criminal charges. Prairie View A&M, by the way, still faces this kind of suppression. In 2018, they were the student dorms. One fell in one precinct and one fell in another. So they were trying to tell students they had to go to two different polling places if they lived on campus, and folks were not allowed to vote where they. And in 2018, folks were not sure where they were supposed to vote. Prairie View A&M, the students are ready to defend their rights, but it is frustrating that they still have to. Right. Tommy, could you drop your question in the chat if you have a question? Thank you. All right. The 2003 Texas Redistricting. This is something that I remember pretty well, even though I was young. In 2002, Republicans won control of the Texas state legislature for the first time in 130 years. And in 2003, they redrew the redistricting maps. Redistricting maps are typically supposed to be redrawn every 10 years. But of course, the rules only work if they're enforced. So the Republicans redrew the maps out of cycle. It took several special sessions. I don't know how many of you were watching the drama of special sessions last year during the summer, but the governor just called, Rick Perry at the time, just kept calling special sessions and kept calling special sessions. Democrats broke quorum. It was very dramatic. It's a great Wikipedia page to scroll through if you've got the time. But essentially, Republicans redrew the maps out of cycle and took the majority of the U.S. House seats for the first time since Reconstruction. Will we see comebacks? Tommy asks, will we see comebacks of drive-through voting or 24-hour voting in Harris County? What process must the legislature go through? That's a great question, Tommy, and I will talk to you, or I'll speak to that when we get to the legislation section, if that works for you. So many of you may be thinking, as I was, weren't we still under the Voting Rights Act at the time? Did this get through the pre-clearance? It did get through pre-clearance. This 2003 redrawing of the maps, the Department of Justice at the time said, only one of these districts is drawn in a discriminatory way. So we are going to, in a racially discriminatory way. So we are going to uphold it. Redistricting is very wonky, and I am, literate, but not an expert in it. But in 2006, the DOJ approved these redrawings in 2003, and in 2006, SCOTUS upheld the redistricting, except for the 23rd Congressional District, which was racially gerrymandered in violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And it's important to note something that we all probably know. In Texas, courts have found racially gerrymandered districts in Texas in every single cycle since 1970. Even the Fifth Circuit, which is one of the most conservative, the most conservative circuit in America, has found some of these districts to be discriminatory. This is our lovely Texas 35. That is one of the craziest drawings of a district that exists in America. And then I have included, just to the right, this company that makes jewelry out of the worst gerrymandered districts in Texas. And that is the TX35 necklace. If any of you are looking, my birthday is next year. I have one every year. And this necklace is exactly my stupid, goofy taste. Voting in Texas after the Voting Rights Act, after Shelby County, how's it going? Not great. In 2019, the death of SB9, I love to reminisce on SB9. So every cycle that I've been working at Texas Civil Rights Project, the Republicans will pass, or the Texas Republicans, usually led by Texas State Senator Brian Hughes, will drum up an extreme voter suppression bill. And in 2019, it was SB9. SB9 was radical and extremely harmful. It would have increased jail time and fines for mistakes in filling out voter registration. It would have created new red tape for elderly voters, voters with disabilities, non-English speaking voters, long forms they would have to fill out before they could cast a ballot. And of course, you could criminalize the mistakes on those forms as well. And it granted law enforcement immunity from prosecution for election-related crimes. That one is so wild to me that I can't believe it wasn't a fever dream I had, but it was, we suspect it was intended to help law enforcement run election-related stings. I don't know if any of you have ever seen Bait Car on like True TV, but it is like they would essentially entrap people to, I think, boost the numbers of voter fraud they were reporting, which to me sounds like creating voter fraud. Anyway, all this was terrible, but it didn't pass. Advocates from every group I know, and there were a lot of folks who were not associated with groups who were just there because they cared about voting, hauled up to the Capitol, testified all night, and were able to keep the bill from moving forward back in 2019. It never got scheduled for its final vote, so it died at the end of the session. I remember there was one representative who was blocking it, and he couldn't go to his son's graduation because he would have had to leave the floor, and if he left the floor, they would have had the numbers to bring SB9 to a vote. And so it was amazing. We did it. We defeated the big voter suppression bill that year. There was still a smaller voter suppression bill that year, but it was much smaller. And then, of course, 2021, the SB1, the Zombie SB1, I call it the zombie all the time. It simply refused to die. SB1 is law now. It started as HB6 and SB7, so it was incredibly hard to remember what was still in the bill or what it was called. Advocates fought it through the end of the regular session and through 2 special sessions, and then it passed at the end of the second special session, which was the 3rd total session. What's a special session? When the governor is not satisfied with the work that has been done during the regular session, which ends on a fixed date at the end of May or the beginning of June, can't totally remember. So the first session, the regular session, ends on a fixed date. If they haven't done what Governor Abbott wants, or Governor Perry, or whoever, Governor Ann Richards, if they haven't done what the governor wants by then, the governor can call a special session to get more things passed, and the governor can keep calling special sessions as much as he or she would like, or they would like. And SB1 passed at the end of one of those extra sessions. The Democrats broke quorum and to keep the bill from passing. And it's important to note, all these delays made the bill better, which I'll talk about in a second. And after SB1 passed, things got bad immediately, like we all said they would. More than 12% of mail-in ballots were rejected in the primary. And that comes to 24,000 votes across Texas, which is a huge number of votes to be rejected. To me, what I saw as the goal of SB1 was to cut off local innovations. So earlier we had a question about drive-through voting, late night voting. All these things were innovations that started in Harris County or Travis County, or I believe there were some that started in Bear, and a lot of other counties adopted them or tried to adopt them when these innovations weren't getting tangled up in litigation. But SB1 now makes it illegal in Texas to do drive-through voting, illegal to do late night voting after 10 p.m. or early morning voting before 6 a.m., which means outlaw of 24-hour voting. It's also illegal to now proactively send out mail-in ballot applications. If you want a mail-in ballot application, you have to go to your county's website. You have to have a printer, which a lot of us do not. And you have to be able to print that out yourself, or go down to your county elections office and pick one up, or call and request one, all of which are a lot harder than it just showing up at your door if you need one, and you can throw it away if you don't. So the question was, will we see comebacks of drive-through voting or 24-hour voting in Harris County? I wish we would. I would love to say yes, but they're now illegal under SB1. The legislature would have to repeal these parts of the law. It would not be hard to do if the legislature had the numbers. If there were enough voting rights advocates in the legislature to do it, it would not be hard to get rid of it, but it would be hard to get those numbers. There are still innovations that can be had. It is a little frightening now to think that any county that creates an innovation that is legal might trigger a law that makes it illegal by the next session. Very frustrating, but I think the counties are still the place where I think we can make the most change. And there are a lot of county elections officers who are willing and able and excited about expanding the right to vote and making it easier and eliminating some of these hurdles. But we have to have the hurdles that the state says we have to have. And SB1 was much worse at different points. Earlier versions of SB1 included partisan poll watchers having the right to video voters while they voted. That did not pass. I can't emphasize this enough. If somebody is videoing you while you're casting your ballot, that is illegal, and you should call 866-OUR-VOTE. Giving judges the power to overturn elections. Again, this did not pass, but it was in there at one point and eventually was not in the bill. We got that out of there. A ban on Sunday morning voting, which is traditionally called Souls to the Polls for a lot of Black churches that will bus Black church members to the polling place and vote. They said that there was a typo. They did not mean to eliminate Souls to the Polls. They just happened to make the typo of cutting off voting at 11 a.m. or not starting voting till 11 a.m. on Sunday. They made that same typo over and over. It sounds real. I mean, 11 a.m. is so easy to type at 4 or 5 different places in your bill by accident. Huge mistake. Anybody could have done it. If you're more interested in learning about SB1, you can learn more in our July 27th training. And you can always, my email is emily@texascivilrightsproject.org. I'll drop that in the chat at the end of the presentation. But if you have a specific question about SB1, me or my colleague Carl or any number of folks that we know could help you out. What's next? All right, got about 20 minutes. I'm going to try to predict the future in the next 20 minutes. Unfortunately, I think we're more likely to, I can't tell what the lottery numbers are, but it's a lot easier to tell what is going to happen in voter suppression in Texas because a lot of it's already happened. And I think it's just the same themes over and over again. Same song, umpteenth verse. What happened in the past? Vote suppressors trying to scare likely voters before voting even starts, poll watchers intimidating voters during voting, and then in the more recent past, people trying to overturn valid, legitimate, proven election results. And I think all three of these things are likely to make a horrendous comeback. Pre-election suppression. We talked earlier about some of these challenges to voter registration, some of these things that said, oh, there's phantom voters when there really were no phantom voters. And this is still happening in Texas today. In 2018, a ballot security committee chair named Alan Vera in Houston challenged 4,000 voter registrations in Harris County. There is a law that says you can challenge someone else's voter registration in your county. But here's how the law works. You have to have personal knowledge that somebody's voter registration is no longer valid. So my friend Doug is on this call. Let's say that Doug and I went to law school together in Austin, which we did, and then I moved to Houston, which I did. Doug had personal knowledge that I moved. Doug could then go to the Travis County registrar and say, Emily is no longer registered in Travis. Emily moved. I know she moved. Please cancel her Travis County registration. You don't need to do this. They will cancel it when you don't respond to their mailers. And when you no longer live there and you're not voting there, they will take you off the rolls legitimately. There is not really any need unless Doug just needs something to do on a Tuesday afternoon, and I think he keeps quite busy. So he would probably not need to challenge my registration, but it is available. That avenue is available. Alan Vera had internet volunteers. I say that word with those words with great judgment. Comb through voter rolls and some database they had, looking for voters who had listed the locations of post offices, parcel stores, or places of business as their address. If Alan Vera determined that it was not a house or one of his friends from the internet, then he would challenge that voter's registration. That does not constitute personal knowledge. And he did that for 4,037. He had 4,037 challenges. 1,700 of those were duplicates of ones he already had in there. And all of those voters none of those voters were legitimately challenged. None of those registrations were legitimately challenged. It is just a tactic to keep folks, to make folks afraid, to have folks get to the polling place and say, oh, I'm here to vote. I'm so-and-so. And they're like, oh, so-and-so is not registered. It says you don't live where you live. And these pre-election suppression tactics are always going to come up. Mid-election suppression tactics. I am very concerned about poll watchers. In SB1, and my colleague Janelle will talk more about this in a couple weeks, but in SB1, poll watchers are given much greater powers. They are very protected by the law now. A poll watcher is essentially just a person who is appointed by a candidate, campaign, or party. You can have poll watchers for ballot measures as well. Each candidate or campaign gets a set number of poll watchers they can have at different polling places. They have to take a training that you can click through in 5 seconds. I did it. It was not a substantive training. And then once you have printed off your little certificate, you can go into the polling place and observe people as they vote. You are not supposed to interfere, but we at TCRP have gotten calls about people who are in the polling place voting, and a poll watcher has looked over their shoulder. This was a Black woman was voting, and a poll watcher looked over her shoulder and said, are you sure that's who you want to vote for? That conduct is not allowed, but the damage was done, right? Like once that woman has tried to intimidate that voter, it's already done. It's not allowed, but it happened. And a lot of the poll watchers for parties and a lot of the poll watchers are fine. Some people are just there to see, ballots are being cast, nothing looks funky. Another, strong link in the chain of democracy. Some poll watchers are there to scare voters, and to scare specifically voters who aren't white. It's happened in the past. We've gotten calls about it. Now all poll watchers are, they're not allowed to be kicked out of the polling place by the election judge unless they're doing something that specifically breaks the law. There was at one point in SB1, not even a cop could kick a poll watcher out, which is wild. Now it has to be police who kick a poll watcher out of the polling place. I think that this is going to be weaponized in the fall. We have not actually seen a situation where poll watchers would have come up because we just had the primary elections. Primaries, you vote in whichever party you're a part of. So the poll watchers on the Republican side are Republican, on the Democratic side are Democratic. And those poll watchers would not want to, there were some nasty primaries, but by and large, those poll watchers don't want to kick their own party's voters out. We are now going into a time where all the parties are using the same polling place, regardless of who you are voting for or which combination of parties you're voting for. We're all using the same polling places now, and the poll watchers are going to be adversarial, I think. I would love to be wrong, but this is something I'm very worried about coming up in the fall. And post-election suppression, my colleague James said, why don't you have a slide about post-election suppression? It is very scary. And I think the reason I didn't have a slide is because I am very scared by it and can barely confront it, but y'all are giving me strength here. So in 2020, Ken Paxton, our illustrious Attorney General, who is under indictment, brought a lawsuit on behalf of Texas contesting election results in Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. The Supreme Court said, you don't have standing to contest these other states. This Supreme Court is not unaligned with Ken Paxton. For this Supreme Court to throw Ken Paxton's argument out, the right thing to do. But Ken Paxton is still our Attorney General. And he is still has a lot of power in this state. And there are going to be election results in this state that he doesn't like. Also, we have a new Secretary of State since the 2020 elections, John Scott. He was one of Trump's personal attorneys trying to overturn the results in Pennsylvania, I believe, along with author of SB9 and SB1, Brian Hughes. So these folks, the people who run Texas, have not shown respect for the results of a fair and free election. And I think, usually at the end of election day, I clock out and I go drink a glass of either happy champagne or sad champagne and finish election season at, 7:01 on election night. I think now our work is just beginning at 7:01 on election night. Because the will of the voters is in more danger than it's been in the past. Oh my gosh, this all sounds terrible. What can we do? Well, this is the pitch part of my presentation. The good news is you can help. You can sign up to be an election protection legal volunteer. And I do have to warn you that if you're attending more than one of these trainings, you will hear this more than once. But we'll have different people doing it. It'll be new and fresh every time. If you go to txcivilrights.org/22EP-legal, 22EP-legal, without the exclamation point. Sorry, I shouldn't have put that on there. That's confusing. But that link without the exclamation point, you can sign up to be a volunteer with us. Essentially, we provide customer service to voters to navigate these crazy systems to help them jump over these horrible hurdles. Any voter can call 866-OUR-VOTE. It doesn't have to be, we're nonpartisan. I will truly help anybody vote as long as they are a registered legal voter. I will help them vote. We help them solve complex issues. A lot of time, there are a lot of things that just take an attorney, as much as it pains me to say. I always say that, law school hypos never happen. Those crazy, like, torts series of events, the Rube Goldberg machines of torts hypos, those aren't going to happen in real life. They are going to happen in election law. There's always going to be like the most complicated, crazy thing. And solving these issues is not only really helpful and makes an impact, it can be really fun. We operate command centers all across Texas during early voting and on election day in all the major metro areas, and we're offering some online options this fall as well. We would love to have you join us to help solve some of these horrible, horrible problems. Thank y'all for joining us, for tuning in. A little bit of a grim hour, but I hope you enjoyed it. You can claim your CLE credit with this number here. You can also scan the QR code to log in to the bar and claim it there. I don't love QR codes, but if you can I did not take your bar numbers. I am sorry about that, but so I can't report your attendance for you, but if you could report it, that would be great. Next week, my colleague Carl Blair is talking about issues that are facing incarcerated voters, and it's going to be very exciting. And I am looking forward to both hearing from somebody really smart and not talking the whole time. If y'all have any questions, oh, is that volunteer opportunity only available for attorneys? No, it's not. Great question, Nicole. If you go to that link, you'll see another link. If you would like to be standing outside a polling place, helping answer voters' questions and solve voters' problems without being an attorney, you can do that too. And that link is available within the page that I just gave you. Thanks for that question. All right, that's all that I have. I'll leave this slide up for a few minutes just so folks can get the CLE number down and probably close her down in around about 7. But thank y'all so much. Really enjoyed it.